The study session of the Independent School District 535 School Board is called to order at 5 o'clock p.m. on Tuesday, February 28th, 2023, in room 137 of the Edison Building. The board acknowledges this site and all RPS sites are situated on the ancestral land of the Dakota people, and we honor the Dakota nations and the sacred land of all indigenous peoples. Interested members of the public are welcomed and encouraged to view this meeting remotely at youtube.com/ISD535, where the live stream video is available. The agenda and documents for this meeting are available online at rochesterschools.org/board docs. Present at this meeting are school board members, Superintendent Ken Pacal, a non-voting ex officio member, and Assistant School Board Clerk, Ms. Lori Sam. Ms. Sam, would you please call the roll?
Director Barlow?
Here.
Director Cook?
Here.
Treasurer Garcia?
Here.
Director McLaughlin? Here. Director Bartlett? Director Martin?
Oh, here.
Chair Nathan?
Here.
Vice Chair Woodman? Here.
At this time, we offer the opportunity to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Are there any changes to the agenda? Second. It's been moved and seconded to approve the agenda. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The agenda has been approved. Our first item is 3.01, Public Schools Week. This is an information item. Families, educators, school leaders, and public education advocates representing more than 10 million members across the country are joining together this week to celebrate Public Schools Week 2023. Public Schools Week brings together families, educators, and community members to shine the light on local public schools and share the stories of the positive things happening in classrooms and school buildings nationwide. As we know very well, the teaching and learning in our Rochester Public Schools positively impacts students and families, the neighborhoods and communities they live in, and our nation as a whole. With commitment, creativity, and critical thinking, our educators and school leaders continue to provide welcoming and engaging learning opportunities for our children. Governor Walz issued a proclamation declaring this week Public Schools Week in Minnesota, and I'll read the proclamation. Whereas more than 845,000 children across Minnesota attend public schools, and Minnesota's public schools prepare our young people to contribute to their local community, state, and country. And inclusive and safe public schools teach children to think critically, problem solve, and build relationships. And students, teachers, paraprofessionals, school staff, student support staff, and administrators make Minnesota's public schools a vital component of the community. And effective two-way engagement between families and public schools improves student outcomes and supports school improvements. And partnerships between public schools and communities help improve outcomes for children across Minnesota. And stable, equitable, predictable, and adequate funding for public schools is necessary to ensure that students have well-prepared and supported educators and a learning environment where all students can succeed. And public schools are critical to successfully advance equity and excellence in educational opportunities and student outcomes. Now, therefore, I, Tim Walz, Governor of Minnesota, do hereby proclaim February 27th to March 3rd as Public Schools Week. So if you're interested in celebrating Public Schools Week on your own, those watching or in this room, feel free to reach out and write a thank you or email to anybody you know who's working in our schools. The hashtag for the week is Here for Our Kids, and we definitely know that all the people in our buildings are doing that every day. Our first focus topic for tonight is our DISC 10 update, expand and upgrade student mental health services. This is an information item. Superintendent Paquette.
Thank you, Chair Marvin and board members. Just a point of process here. We have some colleagues who are going to give us an overview of our work in progress around mental health. And we have some colleagues behind us who are going to be joining us for a discussion of bullying. And just so everybody knows, we will swap places in between. And I've already told the mental health team they're welcome to stay, but I think they're all going to depart. And then we'll squeeze you folks in for that discussion in between the two. So our first subject is part of our ongoing work on the Rochester Public Schools Strategic Plan. As board members are aware, there are 11 DISC teams at work this school year, DISC standing for District-Wide Initiative for Systems Change. And broadly stated, the process that each of those groups is following is first getting conceptual clarity on what the direction in the strategic plan means in very practical terms. And then the second is developing a detailed implementation plan over the next several years to bring that strategy to life. I am in between those two deliverables, thinking and talking with our chair and vice chair about which issues need to come to the board for reasons of policy or budget. Most all of our DISCs are still in the midst of completing what we call Deliverable 1, which is gaining conceptual clarity on the needs of the district and the direction that we're headed. We know the strategic plan says expand and enhance mental health services for students and staff, but how do we do that? So what you're going to get now from our DISC team that is focused on that priority on mental health is very much an update on a work in progress. They've not yet shared with me that Deliverable 1, at which point I'll be talking with Kathy and Julie about what in that might need to come to the board for either policy or budgetary reasons. And then by June, you will receive the implementation plan for this DISC along with all of the others. So that's where we are in this process. This has been a group that has actually, I think in a very good way, gone beyond their initial charge to adopt a really ambitious research-based assessment of mental health services in school districts, which was not contemplated in the initial charge, but I love that expansion of the ambition of what they've bitten off. And so the work, as you all know, is ably led by our Chief Academic Officer, F.A. Agbamu, and I think I will leave it to F.A. and the team to all kick us off there. I don't know if, Connie, you're going to be first, but I will let everybody introduce themselves and then jump into the conversation.
Great. Okay. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting us. We're happy to share the information today with you all, though the information isn't all happy, good news. So happy to be here with you today. My name is Connie Grimsrud. I'm the Director of Student Services, and I'm joined here by two colleagues. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Peter Ruck, Research Assessment and Evaluation.
And I'm Sarah Clark. I am one of the two social emotional learning coordinators, but in this particular place, I am serving as a licensed professional clinical counselor. That's my expertise.
That's right. That's right. And so we just wanted to, you all have the documents in front of you. We're just, as Superintendent Pakel just said, we're going to give an overview of some of the data that you've had now, and just letting you know that we are going to focus in on our charge was to focus on the supports that we currently have available and kind of weigh those against what the needs of our students are and what they're telling us that they need. In addition to some funding stream utilization to be able to provide maybe some enhancements going forward. We're not quite ready to talk about that, as Dr. Pakel mentioned, but we will talk to you a little bit about how we've been doing and how we've made some of the, what we've learned so far. We engaged in a two-pronged needs assessment as part of our DISC team by utilizing something called the SHAPE tool from the University of Maryland. This is absolutely evidence-based needs assessment that many schools across Minnesota and across our nation are utilizing to kind of come up with what is best practice in terms of comprehensive school mental health systems. And so we engaged with the SHAPE tool. It's free. It's also it's a fidelity measure, so you can return to it many, many times over and you can gain information from it. It's full of resources about how to create system-wide comprehensive school mental health programs and systems, and it's been very, very useful, although a lot of information. It's an enormous body of both data, research, and resources. So we used that SHAPE tool to take a look at our systems. It involved many, many surveys that we're going to kind of give you an overview about here today. And then balance that with our student needs. We have several data points we're going to introduce to you about what our students are telling us that they need. We utilize the Minnesota Student Survey. We utilize some of the Panorama Student Survey results. You'll see some of those data points. And then we also surveyed our practitioners, the people in our buildings, the professionals in our buildings who are working with students every day, to let us know what they're seeing and what they see their role as and how they're supporting reporting along with what their students are telling them that they need. The last piece of data you're going to see here is something, some numbers from Fernbrook Family Center. They are one of our community agencies that we partner with to provide school-linked mental health services to students within our buildings. All Fernbrook data is going to be representative, although we have two other agencies we also partner with in our schools. We have school-linked mental health services in all but every one of our school buildings. Sarah's going to talk a little bit about some terminology that's very, very helpful for you to review and really take in, because we want to make sure that we're coming from the same vantage point when we're talking about terminology regarding mental health.
Yeah, I think when we talk about the difference between mental health and mental illness, it is very important to know what we're talking about. Because mental illness is not necessarily just the opposite of mental health. And when we talk about students struggling, we don't want to say students who are struggling with mental health, because that's not what they're struggling with. They're struggling with maybe poor mental health or mental illness, but it's not the same thing. When we talk about mental health, we're talking about a series of relational systems that we all have that help us relate to ourselves, help us relate to others, and help us relate to our community. And when we think about that, we want to think about it on a developmental spectrum, right? What is mentally healthy for a kindergartner may not be mentally healthy for a 40-year-old woman. So we want to think about how that looks for each individual person. There are factors that contribute to our wellness and how we interact with others, how we relate to ourselves, and how we make healthy choices about our lives. If we go on to the next slide, we can talk about mental illness. Mental illness is not necessarily the absence of mental health. It is a specific set of symptomology that we can look at with different people that are diagnosable. So I may not, like in the same way that I may have poor physical health but not have a diagnosable illness, I could have poor mental health and not have a diagnosable mental illness. A diagnosable mental illness means that you meet a certain set of diagnostic criteria that is laid forth out in the DSM. That's the Diagnostical Statistical Manual. That is what mental illness is. So that's important for us to know as we're talking about student mental health and student mental illness. So if we move on to what we're talking about when we talk about systems assessment, we did the SHAPE assessment that Connie referenced a little bit ago, and it went over 7 different domains: teaming, needs assessment and resource mapping, screening, mental health promotion services and supports, early intervention treatment services and supports, funding and sustainability, and impact. All of those domains were scored by our DISC team. There's a group of about 10 of us that meet on a weekly or every other week basis, and every single one of those members filled out these surveys and gave us a score that told us kind of where we're at in terms of strengths and weaknesses. If we look at the next slide, that'll tell us what that looks like. So you can see the score for each of them. We don't have mastery in any of them, which on one hand is kind of a bummer, but on the other hand is a really great way for us to see we can grow in a lot of areas. We are progressing in 3 areas, we are emerging in about 5 areas, and screening, currently we do not have any universal mental health screening, and we will address that later in our presentation. Each team member filled out surveys, and what we did then is we looked at our scores and we determined priorities by having each team member then rank each of the 7 domains based on need for change, desire for change, barriers to change, resources necessary, and potential impact of change. And so when we looked at all of those scores, we discussed together as a group what might be the benefits or the drawbacks to focusing initially on each one of those. We looked for something that was maybe low barrier and high impact, because we want to have early success followed by easy to gain progress. We want to have momentum so that we can move forward into harder things. And when we looked at that, we saw that needs assessment and resource mapping came out as one of our top priorities, followed by teaming processes. When we talk about resource mapping, what we're talking about is an easy to see, easy to access guide for anybody to look at that's able to say, if I have a student that is struggling in this way, here are the resources that we have available, and this is the way that we can access those resources. This is an easy way for us to say, here's how we refer students on to the next step of intervention, possibly treatment, whatever we might require for that. And also, what are the needs that we have for our students? So SHAPE gives us an idea of what our system is able to support. We need to know what our students need from us. So we did that piece already. And then the next is teaming and teaming processes. If we want to have a good system for supporting students, we have to have universal processes for the way that our teams talk about and support students' mental illness and mental health. If we can move on to the next one. This next slide shows what services we already have in place for a number of different things that students might need support with. What we did here is a small group of professionals who have deeper knowledge of what systems are available at Rochester Public Schools, talked about what services we currently provide for students. And we can see where there are some gaps. Right? So if we look at the anxiety domain, we have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and referral services for students who might be struggling with anxiety. If we look at psychosis, for example, we really only refer students out for students who are struggling with psychosis. And that honestly might be appropriate, because within a school system, we might not have the capacity to deal with a student who's struggling with psychosis. But it's good for us to see what we have in place. And so, our student needs assessment, is this, yes, that's you.
Yep, I got
Thank
it. I got it.
Perfect.
So now we're going to shift a little bit to some of the data points that we taught. You learned a little bit about SHAPE, what it can offer us, what we've been looking at. Now we're shifting to the other prong of our assessment, which is the student needs. What are our students telling us? And you're going to see all of the ways, I reviewed this earlier, but all of the ways that we have data reported for what our students are telling us that they need. We utilize the Minnesota Student Survey. You're going to have data on that in your packet. Panorama, the informal survey of our EMW or school counselor and school social work teams within buildings, practitioners doing the work, and along with that diagnostic data gathered from Fernbrook Family Center. The student demographics, again, this is just a recap for you in case you wanted to brush up about when the Minnesota Student Survey is given. It's grades 5, 8, 9, and 11. For the EMW team survey data, you'll know that it's roughly K-12. We do have these, we have social workers working in our early childhood systems. Right now, the early childhood data is not included in that practitioner data because they don't provide services in quite the same way. The student data from Fernbrook reflects that which is provided only through school-linked mental health, not to our community members, our students that may access those services outside of school.
All right, so my role is relatively brief. I'm just going to walk you through the questions and be available if any of the data jumps out and you have some questions about that as well. Our first source for this information is the Minnesota Student Survey. Really quickly, that's a survey that's done every 3 years statewide except for 6 counties. And that survey includes a lot of different information on activities, all sorts of different topics. But for our purposes, there are questions within the survey that are geared specifically towards mental health, as well as behaviors that may be related to or indicative of mental health. These survey items are asked of certain grades only, and each grade does get slightly different questions. So for example, 5th graders don't get asked about suicide, right? But high school students do. And you'll see that in the data. All right, so my intention is not to read through tables of numbers. I know that all of you had this in your packets. But I did highlight a few notable items at the top of the screen here. Do you have any long-term mental health, behavioral, or emotional problems lasting 6 months or more? And I highlighted the first row both because of the percentage of students responding yes, but also because of the gender difference between the two groups over time. The last question is also notable, asking about the comfort students have with talking about these problems with a counselor or social worker. A not insignificant number of students said they didn't have one of those at their school, which may or may not be accurate. But the number right above that, not at all comfortable, you see a substantial portion of the students wouldn't approach those individuals if they had these problems to begin with. The next two slides, I'm putting them up there just for reference. I'm not going to go through any of the individual data results. There are 4 items in the Minnesota Student Survey that are derived from what's called the PHQ-9. That's an internationally recognized mental health screener. We also have a couple of items from the GAD-7, which is the next slide.
Yep, got it. Oh, sorry.
You did it on your computer.
Okay.
GAD-7 is a generalized anxiety screener, and there are items from the survey on there as well. The next slide shows self-harm and self-injurious behavior, as well as contemplating the same. Again, I won't read through the individual results. However, it is notable, again, if you look at those last 2 numbers, the gender difference and the increase in frequency over time, like with age, I guess I should say, not over time. All right, and then panorama. So panorama items that are relevant for this discussion are largely surrounding the idea of emotion regulation and being able to describe your feelings adequately, and then also how you are able to respond when someone is angry or upset around you. We provided in the slide decks for your review a lot of, or the individual results for each of these questions. Again, my intention is not to read through them, but they are there for reference, for discussion, and if we have any questions about them. Panorama is given, let me back up.
Oh, sure.
No, I'm not you, sorry. The panorama survey that you're seeing here was given in fall of 2022. That's our most recent data. We do have trend data on some of these items, but not all. There are also subtle differences on some questions for grades 3 through 5 versus 6 through 12, which is why they're broken out. Some of them are identical, but there are a few where there's some subtle differences. And so that is why you have the grade breakout between the 2 levels. And with that, I would turn it back to Sarah.
Yeah. So this next data set comes from our EMW team members, most notably school counselors and school social workers. Earlier this school year, we wanted to just kind of get a snapshot of what their days looked like, what the students they served were presenting most with, their most presenting complaints. So we sent out a very informal Google survey. This is very anecdotal evidence, so I want to make sure that we clarify this is anecdotal based on self-report, what they are spending their time on and what they're seeing from students. We want to go to the next slide. Kind of hard to decipher, but if we look at this, what we'll see is what they reported is the top 3 mental health struggles that they're seeing with students on a daily basis are depression, anxiety, and ADHD. Now, the other thing that I want to point out here is that if we lump the traumas, we've kind of separated out trauma stemming from different things. If we lump those together, trauma would arise as one of the top 3. And that's good to know, and that's important data to look at. If we can look at the next one. The top 3 factors that our EMW team members see as contributing to these mental health struggles are seen up here. Again, I'm not going to read all of them, but you'll see a lot of it has to do with home situations. The COVID-19 pandemic rose to the top, as well as social media. So that's, again, information for us to know and for us to think about how we might intervene with students going forward. This has to do with percentage of student population that struggles with mental illness or has mental health challenges, and how much time they spend during their day dealing with mental health struggles. You can look at that yourself and just kind of see that most of their time, and of course this is sort of biased information because these are professionals that are supposed to be dealing with mental health struggles and mental illness, but they spend quite a bit of their time, and they estimate that quite a large percentage of the student population has some sort of mental health struggle. can move on to the next one. The next data point is from Fernbrook Family Center. They're one of our 3 providers of school-linked mental health services. This is data that we got from Shannon Brown, who is the CEO of Fernbrook Family Center. She gave us some data around most common diagnostic codes that are used through their therapists and students served. So if we can move on to the next one, you can see the thing that I find compelling about this particular information is that the most commonly used diagnostic codes line up pretty directly with our anecdotal data from our EMW team members. And I think that's very helpful for us to see. The other piece that I want to point out here that I had to ask for clarification was the difference between student served and diagnostic assessments. As a provider, I would think that those numbers would match up, because we need a diagnostic assessment for students to be served. What the explanation that I got was many of these students have diagnostic assessments from other providers or from past school years. So even though that looks discrepant, it's really not. And I think what we want to do now is just kind of summarize some of the data. I'm not going to read all of these points verbatim to you, but some of the things to kind of reflect on are some of what Peter brought up, is that we found overall our female students have more struggles or reported more struggles than our male students. We can see that in some key indicators of social and emotional competencies, which are not the same. I want to be very clear. Social and emotional competencies are not the same as mental health struggles, but they might relate in some way. They show some struggles between 18 and 30%, and the same with 6th to 12th graders. There are a certain percentage of students who have those struggles. And also, I also want to point out the similarity between Rochester Public Schools professionals and external providers and what they're seeing as most common diagnostics.
And so, in conclusion, we have presented lots of data, lots of information from what our teams are telling us, what our professionals are telling us, what our students are telling us that they need. And as we prepare to wrap up deliverable 1 for presentation to Superintendent Purcell in the coming week or so, just wanted you to know some of the things that we have kind of concluded in our DISC team so far. And what it looks like, and you've seen this in the slides, is that we really need to create an accurate and a user-friendly resource map. We need to know where our resources are, we need to know who has access to them and how students and families access them, and how our professionals know how to access outside resources as well. It became very apparent that that was a priority that we will be recommending the move forward with. Second, mental health screening. As you saw in the data, we don't have any universal type of screening systems, and actually one of our top priorities may not actually be a mental health universal screener. However, we do need to focus in on screening and providing a resource, potentially a mental health screener for those students who are referred to our practitioners, so that we can ensure that the proper evidence-based interventions are accessed once a student referral is made. Next, our longer-term priorities absolutely have to do with universal teaming processes. This aligns very well with teaming processes around other strategic plan initiatives, namely MTSS. It aligns beautifully. We definitely see a connection between both the work that we're doing and the MTSS team is doing. We need to identify sustainable funding sources. We know that last week you approved as a board the acceptance of an almost $2 million grant for school-based mental health services, and we appreciate that. People worked very hard to bring that to your attention, and we are thankful that we have that. Sustainability-wise, that's a 5-year grant, but it will matter in how we are able to make next steps forward. Next, it's about early intervention, and it's about getting tiered interventions, again, evidence-based, in the hands of every practitioner who sees a student experiencing a mental health challenge or disorder, and making sure that, of course, school climate is also part of another DISC team's work, along with social emotional learning. We know there's a continuum of that, and along with mental health literacy, specifically to support our staff, our building staff, with knowing how to speak about mental health challenges and mental health disorders. that's what we have for you today, and now we'd just like to open up the floor for any questions that you might have of us.
Thank you. You mentioned, clearly it's never been more important to ensure that we have the appropriate resources for our students who are struggling with any kind of mental health issues. Repeatedly throughout these surveys, students have said they feel stressed, they feel anxious, they talked about academic pressures. Is there going to be, and then you talked about school climate, looking at school climate, is there going to be, as part of this, trying to get more specific data about what is happening in our school district that we might be able to change kind of district-wide that might alleviate some of this anxiety that kids are feeling? You know, what does academic pressures mean? I mean, are you going to dig that deep into what might we be able to do at little or no cost that could alleviate some of that anxiety sort of universally in our schools? I'd like a yes or no answer.
I think our DISC team isn't specifically called to address that particular question. I know that we do have DISC teams focusing on school climate, with belonging. That wasn't our specific charge. So I guess I'd refer to anyone else for more information about that, but certainly there's connection.
If I could, just one follow-up. Yeah. We have a group of students, for instance, Dr. Ruck and Mr. Ruffin and I have been working with. And one thing middle school students said is that they feel stressed because teachers tend to give tests on the same day. It's a middle school perception. I mean, it's something like that even that would be no cost to the district, but if that was something that were actually happening, that maybe that would be helpful. And so I don't know if that's going to be a task better conducted by Mr. Ruffin, because he does it so well, and Dr. Ruck. But I'm just thinking about that level of specificity that would be a fairly easy fix that certainly wouldn't alleviate the problem, but it might make it a little bit better.
Maybe I can just briefly say, I think it's an incredibly important question, Dr. Marvin, and I would probably say they're related but distinct. And actually, my area of expertise is much more in the space you're talking about, around academic motivation. Mm-hmm. Because the challenge is actually academic press is also positive for kids. And so we don't want to pull that off. I think, as Sarah explained so crystal clear for me, because this is not my area of expertise, we're in a realm here of mental health and mental illness that I think we might usefully distinguish from academic motivation, though they can blur. I mean, a kid who is overly stressed academically could begin to present. So let me just really agree with the importance of that conversation. We do have a DISC team that is looking at those issues of belonging and school culture. Candidly, it's not as tightly focused on those questions of motivation as you're raising. As we think about the next steps, which we'll be sharing soon with what we've called grading for learning, these issues are very much front and center in that discussion. So we'll be coming back to those discussions of what I might call academic motivation or pressure, somewhat distinct from mental health or even social emotional well-being. Though it all starts to blur together in some constructive ways. So we'll make sure we bring that back.
Good work.
On slide 7, mental health quality domains, what is the range of the scale? I see numbers, but I don't know, is that like a 0 to 5 scale, 0 to 100 scale?
That's a great question. I believe it's 0 to 4.
Okay, 0 to 4, okay, that's helpful to, provide some perspective about where.
Yeah, it's not a 10-point scale.
Yeah. Okay, so 0 to 4, okay.
Couple quick questions. Is it, it's safe to say there's probably a direct correlation between behavior and mental health or mental illness? And is there some way that we are at some point able to pinpoint that or to, because sometimes we're focusing on behavior and not necessarily what could be the underlying causes. And I appreciate the work that went into identifying that there are some, well, you didn't use the term ACEs, but there are some adverse situations which exist, that even before our kids reach the school, they're already being impacted. And so then I suppose the real question then for me becomes, if, and Dr. Ruck, you had pointed this out, if our students, a significant portion of them are hesitant in either speaking to a counselor or a social worker, then I know Superintendent Piquel has emphasized relationships are so important, and this may point to an opportunity, whether it be through our, I'm going to say it, the SROs, or, just teachers and staff becoming more aware. And I know in terms of, I would assume that you really weren't making decisions, you were presenting information, which I think is so valuable, and thank you for that. So, thank you. This has been quite useful. I do wonder what percentage of referrals, I think, was that 248, was that a whole number of students referred out to Fernbrook rather?
Those are a number of students served by Fernbrook.
Okay. And that may be separate than referrals made too?
Correct.
Correct. Yes.
That's with permission.
Okay.
So I have one more question. On slides 26 and 27, it lists the top 3 mental health struggles being observed with students, and then 3 factors that are contributing to the above mental health struggles. So the people who are observing this, are they aware of an actual diagnosis in the student? So do they know that the student has been diagnosed with depression or ADHD? Or is this just something that they kind of see based on their own expert professional experience, saying, I think this student might be depressed, or I think this student might?
So our counselors and social workers may or may not have access to diagnostic information. Mostly it's based on self-observation and their professional discretion. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
2 questions. One on the same slide that Director Workman just mentioned, on the top 3 factors that are seen as contributing to mental health struggles. The most prevalent category, it starts with unstable, unsafe, or neglect. And what's the rest of that?
Neglectful home situations.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
And then the other thing is the mental health screening. I guess I'm just trying to imagine what you're imagining that could look like. At one point, it was described as universal or the absence of universal. I'm just trying to get my head around what sort of mental health screening we think is advisable, or maybe what came out of the SHAPE assessment. Any more details on what you would be recommending?
So in terms of universal screening, we can go 2 different ways. We can universally screen for social emotional skill development. That's not what we're talking about, although a comprehensive mental health system does address that. You can also go the route of universal mental health screening. In order to really move forward with universal systems of screening, we need to ensure that all of our tiered supports are ready and in place to support the referrals that would come from screening. And right now, what we know is that we want to tackle, potentially the recommendation would be to tackle, once a student is referred, helping that professional staff use a screener to really focus in their intervention. And that will likely be one of the recommendations forward.
Okay, so you're describing kind of an initial needs assessment after a student has been referred for services. And I guess I was making an assumption also. Are parents always aware when students are receiving mental health services, or not necessarily?
The answer is
do they-
yes.
okay,
Yes,
maybe.
we have to bring parents into the mix.
Yeah, okay,
correct.
good.
There are very few caveats where we wouldn't do that, but yes.
Very good. Thank you.
That's my question, to tag on to Director Cook is, so you've identified two ways you could potentially be doing the screening, and when and where is that group or a group of you going to decide what that looks like, and when would we be presented with options?
So deliverable one is we're just wrapping up kind of what we've learned in terms of our needs assessment and how we've prioritized some goals. We will deliver that to the superintendent, and we will get approval of that original plan, and then we'll go to work on some of the goals and priorities and bring those forward by the June date. And I imagine that might be when that you would learn about what the recommendations of the group are. We haven't started deliverable 2 yet because we're just wrapping up this enormous needs assessment right now.
And I appreciate the work that went into that, because it's helpful, I think, for the rest of us to see not only like the sliver maybe of people who are telling us that their student is struggling, but like, what does that actually look like, and what does it mean, and what are maybe some of the more I don't know, tactile ways, I guess, as Director Marvin was mentioning, that we could make adjustments in the school system that aren't necessarily mental health specific, but are affecting mental health. I just had a couple of other questions. So would you be doing an additional needs assessment or incorporating the data from the other two community partners? So like Family Service Rochester collects the same data. Would you be requesting information from them about the schools that they serve to round it out for, I guess, all three service providers?
Sure. We have access to that data at any point. We just happen to get Fernbrooks because it was our largest provider. So yes, when we continue to utilize the SHAPE and we look at how many students are receiving those types of services, the whole number must be included by that point, so that we are including all of the students that have access to that service. But at this point, we've really only been able to grab Fernbrooks because they're our largest provider. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me ask a question. So in the social and emotional competencies, graders 18 to 30%, 11 to 28%, 6 to 12 graders, those are self-assessments.
Yes.
If you were to ask the adults in those settings, would they rank them the same or higher?
Or, I mean, do we know anything about this data that kids tend to underestimate themselves or overestimate?
I can answer that.
There's somebody could answer.
I kind of can.
Panorama has not done that validation,
Correct.
which is notable. You can answer more if you want, Peter. Panorama has taken off, exploded around the country, and they caught a wave. And there are some things that other instruments would have done to validate self-report surveys that, at least from what they put on their technical manual and website, they have not yet started to do. They have another benefit in it, it's super practical, and their interface is great and things like that. But there are some ways to validate self-report that
They have not done.
to my knowledge, they haven't done. So we don't know, really.
And we don't have a question of staff in any of our panorama data to ask that question about students, similar to how the mental health professionals assess what they're seeing in the.
You'd have to ask about an individual kid as opposed to kids in general.
Yep.
And I can just to speak to the mental health screening, I guess, version of that. It's not unusual to see a discrepancy between, like if you're looking at a subjective measure, both the parent is identifying and the student is identifying, that often the kid is saying, yes, there's tons of problems, and the parent's like, no, not really, or the opposite. And I think one of the things that Director McLaughlin and I were talking about before this started was, is it likely that the discrepancy in gender reporting is, or the gender discrepancy in the reporting is it that boys are not experiencing the same level? I think just culturally speaking, we allow young girls to access their feelings more readily than boys, but they're also going to internalize, whereas the boys are going to have behavior, so we'll see a behavior and then we'll react to the behavior, but we may miss some of the girls and the things that they're reporting here, but we don't see it outside of them.
Exactly. That was another question I asked, so thank you for doing that. And my other question about the resource map, you mentioned how parents are aware of what the services are. For the most part, the mental health services are being provided directly to the student. Will the resource map include resources for parents, either who have students who are receiving mental health services or have a diagnosis, or just parents who are concerned about their own students' mental health and how they can support it, as opposed to just identifying and accessing services, but just those other supportive wraparound things that I know students, or I know parents are asking us for.
I think in our discussions about resource mapping, we've talked about mapping not only what's available within the school district, but what's available within the community at large, which would include some of those resources for parents. Yeah.
So Kathy just asked part of my question, but I'll ask the other part, which is, so I know that there's a shortage of mental health counselors, social workers, and what do you think it would take for our district to be meeting the needs of our almost 18,000 students? More than what we have now, I'm assuming. I mean, I think there's a shortage everywhere, isn't that correct?
There's a shortage everywhere, is correct. And we don't even have data in here right now, pre-COVID versus post-COVID.
Right.
You know, so we are flexing and adapting and focusing to the best of our ability, and increasing mental health supports is definitely something that we aspire to, but we're working within our means right now.
So on the end where the students receive services, do they use like a triage system, or is it, first come, first served? I mean, if you have 10 kids with mental illness and you can only serve 5 of them, I'm not expecting you really to know this answer, but, to me, it's really a piece of how important these services are for our young people, and more people need to be going into the profession, and I know it's harder in public schools because the pay often doesn't match up with what they can receive in private practice. But thank you for this presentation and all the work that you do. I think we are so going in the right direction with this, and I'm really glad we got that grant too. Me too. Thank you. Superintendent.
Are you, I'm a big believer in identifying people and organizations that do things really well so we can learn from them and then mercilessly beat them. And so I'm wondering, like in a totally different area, I know Dr. Obama, who rather recently took her, is taking some of our literacy team to look at Roseville's work in that area. Are you aware of, either in Minnesota or nationally, districts that are doing mental health services well, or could we use the SHAPE assessment to identify some of those that are sort of leading edge systems?
Right. I believe I'm aware of one. I believe in Tennessee. I think Memphis is doing it really well. I don't know that the SHAPE tool necessarily points us toward those systems, but I do know that MDE is working closely with cohorts. So there's a SHAPE cohort that will start up in April and into next year that connects schools together in Minnesota to learn from one another. And we already reached out to Rosemont, Apple Valley, Egan, because they have been engaging in SHAPE work for several years now. But beyond that, I guess we haven't dug into yet what those nationwide best practice models are, but certainly within the scope of what we're doing, that would be within our capacity to do so.
Yeah, and of course I'm kidding about beating them. It's about, there's no winners and losers, but I love that, that notion. Every place is going to be different, but for us to be casting our eyes broadly, even as we're doing this deep dive internally, I think is a really great use of our time. So.
Great. Yes, we will.
Any other questions?
I feel like there was a school, was it 2 years ago? Didn't we, wasn't there in the conference, I think it was the school district with the Watt brothers, JJ and all the football stars, went to, and they were doing something incredibly exceptional in Wisconsin. There was like some model that they were using and presented to us that I felt like that done my like mental health brain, but I couldn't, I would have to look back into it. I just go, yeah, it's like University of Wisconsin is all it's bringing up, but I feel like there, whatever school district they went to, there was somebody a couple of years ago that talked about it in our conference, that they were really focused on that piece. So I will deep dive into that.
Anything else, Director? Superintendent?
I just, thank you. Chair Nathan and I were talking about, and also Vice Chair Workman, the caliber of our presentations, I think, at these study sessions and at board meetings just continues to get higher and higher, and that doesn't happen easily. So thank you for all the work that you've put into, of course, the work, but also just to put together this material for this presentation. And I look forward to bringing forward to the board some of the decision points, and then you will review the entire plan along with the other 10 at the end of the school year as part of my evaluation. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us. So I believe this is where you were referring to shift change?
Shift change. I know. No. We went into yeah, let's just fill in, please. There's chairs back here. Please fill in.
Maybe we didn't all need for your own.
There, we got one there.
There's a spot here.
We're not good hosts. We're making them bring their own chairs.
I put some chairs out. Did you bring food in?
No.
Just your chairs?
It's got about a half bottle of water. I do that with people that make things cold.
This next focus topic, 4.02, is on bullying, information item. Superintendent.
Thank you, Chair Nathan. I'll be very brief. As you know, the board's agendas this year are a mix of strategic plan, deep dives, which we just did on mental health, and issues that board members have requested an update on, and this is one of the latter. We had a request a while back to take a look at where we are with bullying, and so Chief of Schools Jackie Peterson has put together some brief summary information for you of where we are, and then we have asked really an all-star team of school leaders to be here with us, so thank you. This will be fluid and I think conversational once we lay the groundwork. I don't know, I think pretty much everybody's known pretty well, but maybe want to do a brief introduction, just sort of name, rank, serial number in terms of like what school you are and name, so we have a sense of that, even though I'm probably not necessary, but I don't want to leave anybody anonymous. So why don't we start, Mark, and then we will jump in.
I'm Mark Randall, and I'm the principal at Gibbs.
Angie McAndrews, principal at Kellogg.
Maxine Hadlin, principal at Binghamton Valley.
Chris Fogarty, principal at Willow Creek.
Tom Olson, assistant principal, Franklin.
Matt Rizek, principal at JAM.
And thank you. We know you all have crazy schedules, so thank you for being here. And turn over to Jackie, I believe, and obviously Chris Lingen is critical also in this work as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm really honored to share the floor this evening with the incredible leaders. As Dr. Patel mentioned, I know at least one of them needs to leave a little bit early for a PTSA meeting, and we certainly don't want to have Martine miss that meeting. So if she gets up and leaves, it's not because she's offended. We didn't necessarily handpick these incredible leaders. We asked all of our school leaders if they would be willing to come and talk about bullying with you, because as you know, we have a policy on bullying and a strict policy on prohibition of bullying, but it's living and breathing in our schools, so it's important for you to hear from the practitioners. You can read the policy, but I think it's critical for you to know how we respond to concerns of bullying, and that's what we're here to do tonight. Chris has a little bit of data to share with you that he'll talk about in a bit, but our intent is to have a conversation with you about what happens when bullying is reported, and how we support our students who come forward with concerns, and the consequences that happen when there are bullying incidents. So Chris, do you want to
Yeah.
take it over with this?
We have a few slides to kind of talk about, but I know that's not the total interest here of what we want, so I'm going to be very brief with some of our slides. I know you want to talk to them to find out, okay, what exactly do we do? So bullying is defined as unwanted aggressive behavior that involves real and perceived power imbalance. And the other piece I want to highlight underneath that is the second bullet is repetition. Bullying behaviors happen more than once or have the potential to happen more than once. Bullying actions include making threats, spreading rumors, attacking someone physically or verbally, or excluding someone from a group on purpose. Definition of bullying, you can find hundreds of definitions on bullying. This is one that we end up using. Bullying or not, the first kind of pieces within there are teasing, or we probably could consider harassment type of things. I want to focus more towards the bottom one, which is actual bullying, which is one student repeatedly threatens another student that if he or she walks down a specific hallway, he or she will beat them up. Another example is one student repeatedly calling another student names regarding his or her sexual orientation. If you notice, we have some repeated pieces within there. The ones above there are teasing. A lot of times we get that from families. I'm being bullied, and they'll go through, it's like, well, it happened one time or whatever, but it needs to be that multiple times. These still aren't good. It could be considered harassment, but not necessarily meets the definition of bullying, which we'll talk more about with the group here as we go. And I know I'm going quickly through this, so if you want me to pause on something, please let me know. But
I think that point you just said, that a lot of times we'll get a call or a student saying, I've been bullied, and when we start to dig into it, it is not over time, it's not unequal power. So it can fall under the category of harassment. So when you look at our Skyward data that Chris will share, it may surprise you the small percentage of discipline referrals we have that end up being actual bullying.
Yep. And the same thing, kind of, we broke it down here with the teasing, which again is harassment type of thing, but the actual bullying is imbalance of power, occurs repeatedly, purposeful and serious, seeks to gain power. The remorse piece is kind of, I'm not sure that's a good one to have in there, but from the place we got it from, it had it. No effort to resolve an imbalance of emotional reaction. Those are kind of definitions that we use when we talk to families about bullying. Again, there's hundreds of them out there. There was a question that was brought up, and we did not put it in the PowerPoint, and I'm sorry we didn't. We actually didn't even think about it until it was brought up to us, and that was about how much bullying is taking place as far as our suspensions and level twos. That was a question that came up from somebody on the board. Is that right? Right now we have, of course it didn't save it when I went back to the thing. So we have about 3% of our level twos and 3% of our suspensions have to do with bullying. So if you think about, we have thousands of, I'll give you the exact number we have of all level twos is, there it is. So we have 2,804 level twos right now. 3.6% of those are bullying that have been labeled in Skyward as bullying. When we do suspensions, I just need to click the other button. We have 101 that have, and again, 3% of our suspensions, so it's almost identical to that number. We have 29 or 101 have been bullying incidents, about 3% within that part of it too. I had the exact data, but when I don't save it, it doesn't come back through that piece, so I apologize for that.
Why don't we, let's commit to provide the board with that.
Yep, I'll do it, if you give me 1 minute to redo that part when they talk, I'll be able to have that. But yeah,
Let's also do it in writing after
Okay,
this, so that's
okay.
great, but I appreciate that. It was a great question that the chair asked
Yeah.
earlier today.
So that's what I have about the bullying piece. You guys want to kind of share kind of what you do, the steps that you go through at your sites and levels, I guess, because obviously we have all different levels here, so we're going to talk about what happens at elementary, middle, and high school, because it's not going to be all the same.
Maybe we can start with an elementary example of what you do when a situation presents. What is your process for investigating?
Well, I can start. I mean, we investigate all situations, even at the elementary level, and we take them very seriously, you know, and sometimes some things will come in and it'll be, well, you know, we're not really sure about that, but we try to dig as deep as we can and get as many students, their viewpoint during, the situation as we possibly can. We have to pull oftentimes at the elementary, we'll pull adults in too, because it'll be a playground supervisor or a lunchroom supervisor. Those are the more common times when those things would typically happen, potentially on a bus. But again, we'll document everything. We'll try to interview as many people as we possibly can. And then we come to some conclusions based off the information that we have. We'll also get the parents involved and let them know and notify them of some of the situations that are happening. We'll use our board policies and this information to determine whether if it's bullying or not. And then, of course, we want to put an end to it. So there is some accountability there for students, even at the elementary. And oftentimes there will be consequences, but we also want it to be a learning experience for the student so that they know and understand how hurtful their messages and their actions can be, so that they can learn, so that when they get to middle school and high school, they've learned the correct behaviors. And it's kind of that restorative practice that we do, with our students, so that they can take it more as a learning experience, but also know that there's some accountability there too. So that's a really brief, version of the way that we kind of handle those situations. And I know Martine and Tom probably have maybe similar or even different ways that they may handle them in their buildings too.
Well, following what you said, we do the same thing. We do follow the matrix really closely, the grid that is in the student handbook, because when we're dealing with bullying, we often have to involve parents at the elementary level really quickly. And parents would say, well, it's probably friendly teasing or hurtful teasing. I don't think my child would bully, but it would be like if their child is being bullied, then it's definitely bullying. So we go to the matrix with actually the parents and say, this is what would be, the matrix, like we're violating the be respectful section of the matrix. And so we, in the process, before we deal consequences, we would reteach, what the behavior, the positive expectation is in the building. We would have students conference with either an equity specialist, a counselor, or a social worker, depending on who is the trusted adult in the relationship. And then we would communicate with family. Then we would probably add, if we think this is ongoing, the restorative practice part. And with the restorative practice part, we do circle for community building, or if we think, this is like student conflict, or if there's real harm that happened, then we take a bigger measure that we do repair the harm circle, where we actually focus on the behavior and not so much on the students, because we want the students to know that they are good, and that they, in character, and they have dignity, but something happened that harmed or broke the relationship, and that's something we can deal with.
I think for some reason it's different in elementary too than when I was in the high school, because if a elementary kid feels they've been bullied, it's like the worst thing that they can be tagged with mentally. I mean, they just seem to be, I was bullied. And so sometimes just explaining, you didn't get along with that person, you called them a name, they called you that back, it's the first time it happened, it's just a disagreement. Sometimes helps them in educating the little ones, those kind of things too. And I think that's a really important part in elementary is getting the parents on board with the verbiage too, because it really does hit them hard. And that's the other part, is teaching the parents, because a lot of our issues of disagreement come on social media, just how to navigate through those apps, because they really don't understand what apps the kids are on too. And so we do a lot of the same things they were doing, but here's how you get on Snapchat, or here's how you look on this, or there's this new app that your child was just on, that they're involving other people from different schools. And so that goes back to I really believe in order to get the kid, you got to have the whole family involved to really get that connection, and just building that relationship with the family and giving them the pieces they need to understand what their kid's going through.
Can you talk a little bit, often parents and students will worry about their safety, their ongoing safety, and what kinds of things do you do at the elementary level to help students feel safe after they've had a bullying situation or something they perceive to be bullying? And how do you reassure parents that you're doing something to support?
Yeah, I was just going to actually mention that. I think the follow-up is really the key for a lot of that. So the student's not feeling safe, or the parent might have a little bit of anxiety about, okay, I'm sending my kid back to school here, and there was a real, true bullying incident or situation. We typically will set up a follow-up plan. So a check-in, check-out with the student. We'll follow up with the parent and communicate them. Here's, kind of how the day went, and here's the follow-up that we're doing. And oftentimes it'll either be one of the administrators, but oftentimes it'll be a counselor or social worker that will help with a lot of, those situations, because they can help them process through their anxiety or some of the feelings that they're going through as part of that follow-up if they're feeling scared to be at school. So we just keep that line of communication open, and I think the follow-up is really important in those situations.
Anything to add to that, Tom or Martine?
I think follow-up is great. While you were talking, I was connecting it to what we were discussing earlier with mental health. I think we do pay a great deal of attention with the follow-up on whether or not there are underlying causes to bullying. What would make a child do something? Is it just behavior, or do we have other things going on that we need to address in those follow-up? And then how do we go forward with that child to completely reintegrate them so that the behavior does not repeat?
You might not like this answer, but the parents that worry about it, I give them my cell number, and they text. Texting is the easiest way to communicate. Mm-hmm. And so, hey, just let me know if he gets home and anything happens so that I can deal with it tomorrow. Haven't been burned on it yet, but I think that makes them feel comfortable knowing that they're going home and they've got a number. Hey, check with her when she gets home or see how it goes, and then, everything was great, awesome. That's all I needed to hear, And I think any way you can just get that communication open, and the old way of email isn't good for a lot of the parents that I work with right now.
Yep.
So just the most unique way that I can get in touch with them.
I think that's gotten more normalized. A lot of us share our cell phone numbers, and thankfully it doesn't generally get abused, but it's a pretty normal support that principals offer.
And I think just parents, when they know that we're working as a team,
Mm-hmm.
they just feel that level of comfort, and the teachers involved, and maybe a para, a counselor, the parent obviously, and administrators. And when they feel that there's that sense of comfort, I think for them, when they feel like there's that team that's kind of working together to make it better for the kid.
And I may add to that parent education is a really big key to this. That's why I'm going to PTA tonight, to be able to align with the parents what we are doing at the building level. For example, we talk about restorative practices. Well, what is that? The parents are asking, why are you doing circles with the kids? Why are you doing all of these things? So now we have to present to the parents, educate them on it, and then say, hey, try something like that at home, and then see if it works. Because then when we're talking, we would have a common language, in the building and with the family. So if I say, I want to have this conference with you, it will be a circle style, whether or not, I'm bringing parents in, because we've done that, to be able to kind of repair completely that harm and have the parents support. Then they understand what we're talking about, and they are not in the dark wondering if we're doing something different, at school than their values at home.
Maybe we should move on to the middle school, and then we can open it back up again, if your idea, Chris, and then high school, and then we can come right back to the big picture discussion.
Sure. So in terms of investigating, I made a couple notes about things that I think sometimes impede our investigation. I think a lot of times in middle school, parents try to coach their kid up at home, and so a lot of times the issues don't go reported until it's a really big deal. So then it feels a lot more emotional. So I always think about that. I say this to parents all the time, sort of like at an airport when you see something, say something. I would rather you report it too soon and we investigate it and we can get to the bottom of it and it does not become a big issue than to ignore it and then all of a sudden what we hear from parents is like, this has been happening forever and we have not been aware of it. So I think that's one thing that I see quite frequently. Typically, the initial report just scratches the surface. Usually there's multiple sides to be considered, so our investigation usually involves a few different layers. In middle school, we hear often that kids don't want to say anything because they don't want to be a snitch. That's a big thing at the middle school level. So I think it's really important that we work to create an environment where it feels safe to report, even if it's anonymous. I always just tell kids, like, even if you just give me a little bit of information, I'll figure it out. I get really good at this after a while. But with initial reports, we usually interview students. And then I usually share with kids my plan for how I'll investigate it so that they feel just a sense of security in that. So sometimes I'll say, I'm not going to tell anybody that this is the report that you gave me. I'm going to interview kids, but if anybody says to you, this is like, I heard that you snitched, you can say no because there's no way that they would know that. So I just think it's important for kids to know where I'm coming from on it so that they know what to expect, because once they're feeling vulnerable enough to be able to say something about it, I think they need to know where the safety comes from. And then we talk about how I'll investigate and then my follow-up plan for how they'll respond or seek support in the meantime. So a lot of times we'll come up with a plan, like if something happens between now and when I get to the bottom of it or follow-up, could you email me? No, I don't. I would feel uncomfortable emailing you. We have a QR code for our counselors and social workers. Could you complete the QR code? Could you ask your teacher to send me a message? Could you tell your parent and they could text me? So we come up with a plan so that they have a way to report it, because sometimes it takes a little while. And then I also often refer back to the Safe and Supportive Schools Act, which I don't even remember when that originated in Minnesota, probably around 10 years ago, but there's this definition that I always share with parents, and it says, it's bullying if it materially and substantially interferes with a student's educational opportunity or performance or ability to participate in school functions or activities. So a lot of times parents will say, well, it's not your business, it happened outside of school. But I say, if what your child did, even outside of school, makes another student so anxious they won't come to school, then it is my business. And so that gets really tricky with social media stuff. But if we have kids that don't come to school because they're scared that this kid's going to continue harassing them, then it is my responsibility, and legally I have to respond to it. So, if we could just make cell phones go entirely, it probably would reduce a lot of that. But I think that definition helps parents take into consideration the larger picture of it. So in terms of investigating, those are some of the pieces that I think are important for us. And then I always put it in my calendar for 2 days out and then 5 days out and then 2 weeks out, just to check back, so did this stop for a couple days or did we actually extinguish it, so that I can connect back with kids. And sometimes it's just running them into the hall, or running into them in the hallway and saying has anything else happened? How you doing? And they give me a thumbs up. Okay, we're good. Or they give me kind of a funny look, and then I know okay, we'll chat later and make sure that this is really, that we're really done with it. So those are some of my notes about the investigation piece of it.
And very similar to what Angie talked about, frankly, I've done more of my bullying investigations at the high school at this point compared to the middle school at Willow Creek. However, I think there's the art of what that initial investigation needs to sound like and look like when you're working with that student. Ultimately, it will come down to when you start getting some of those pieces of information in regards to the facts or how they were perceived. Intent, impact, followed by a question of what are you hoping to gain. So then when you have that follow-up conversation with the student's parents that perceived as the bully, on where that falls in that spectrum of, is it bullying, is it the inappropriate teasing, is it just inappropriate school behavior, is it egregious, wherever those layers may be. And then you tell the child that you're really getting down to that track of a bully. And a lot of their intent was not, the vast majority of the ones I've ever investigated, the intent was not to be a bully. They didn't wake up with that malicious intent to harm. But the impact that they were having on the students was such. Drawing it back to, you had mentioned about some of the consequences of letting that aggressor know in that situation, moving forward, this is really our line in the sand. if there are additional reports in regards to this, the level of discipline rises because you're not following through on what I would frankly call as a really huge intervention to stop this behavior. Similar to Angie with that follow-up, making sure that the child that has been bullied or treated very inappropriately by these behaviors, ensuring that a few key questions are asked, that you have that partnership with home, that you also are asking that child, who do they feel like they have a trusted adult that they're willing to approach, whether it's a teacher, the counselor, many of the different professionals that it could be, letting them know about this awareness, and then that deliberate and intentional follow-up and follow-through with the child at different points in time have been the key to reduce that recidivism rate and for that child to make sure that they feel welcome at school. They don't have to be paranoid, they're not looking over their shoulder.
Do you want us to speak a little bit to consequences too for those types of things?
Sure.
So I think generally we do one of two things. In some cases, some sort of restoration. In some cases, it's larger and it requires something larger than that. So in restorations, we make sure that both kids are willing to participate, and sometimes they're not. I mean, sometimes the victims are like, nah, I don't really want to sit in a room with that kid, and I get that. But then we have the conversation with both sides so that they understand that and still come to some sort of a communication from the offender to the victim so that they understand the offender's point of view. And so usually that is helpful. Usually a counselor or social worker, sometimes an admin will help with those mediations or restorations. We also use a program at Kellogg called CARE, which is an alternative to suspension. CARE stands for the Common Academy for Restoration and Empathy. And CARE really, I think the thing that we're finding with CARE is that it really helps teach new skills. And recently we had a team who presented at the MASSP Winter Conference on this program. We started mid-year last year, so prior to starting the program, we had about 70% of our kids with level 2s have reduced level 2 or suspendable offenses. And in the second semester last year, so the first semester of doing this program, we reduced it from 70 to 33%, and now this year in the first semester, we've reduced from 33 to 23%. And so from 70% of our kids reoffending somehow to 23% of our kids reoffending, that has been pretty substantial improvement for us. It includes restoration, first and foremost, then some sort of reflection, and then after that, a plan for moving forward, including an exit meeting where kids talk about, like, what did I learn? Who did my behavior impact? How, what can people expect from me going forward? And that's been pretty helpful because I think that when we suspend kids and they just go home, we don't have the opportunity to think about, they go home, play video games, take care of themselves, parents are at work, they come back, and there is no lesson learned. And the difference right now is that in those 2 days that they spend in our CARE program, instead of 1 day of suspension, they work with our counselors and social workers intensively to talk about, who's this impacting? And kids will come up with a list, instead of just like, well, me and the kid that I had the fight with, now it's like, well, me and the kid that I fought with, all the kids who observed it in the hallway who now don't feel safe at school, the teachers that had to intervene when this event happened. And so they see the impact. My mom and dad, the principals, the gals in the lunchroom who are trying to intervene and help, so they see that it has a larger impact and that it doesn't really give them the outlet that they're looking for. So, and then ultimately, sometimes in bullying situations, we have to create distance between peers. So we try to fix it rather than Band-Aid it with a changing of a schedule, but sometimes the kids are just so traumatized by what's happened that we maybe will make some of those considerations as needed.
Our process does look similar. High school obviously presents different challenges because we have, in some instances, students who are legally adults. And so we do work with, Chris's point, identifying where it falls in regards to a legal impact of the decision that a student has made, whether it's physical in nature, sexual in nature, harassment. So there's obviously a balance that occurs. For me, and I've spent a long time in elementary world too, communication is paramount. And oftentimes in any instance that happens, it continues to happen when it's not identified. So working on highlighting what it is, how it impacts, who it impacts, typically prevents it from happening a second time. The you all saw in the data, students have a reluctance to share. It's an issue. Whether it's a societal, current societal norm, whether it's a school system norm, whether it's that particular school itself. So for us, we have plans that we put in place as well, safety plans for students so that they can hopefully identify a person within the building that they have a trusting relationship with. The relationship is essential. To Chris's point, the vast majority, we don't really see I have not seen in my short period at JM a significant amount of bullying accusations. It has not been very statistically relevant in regards to reports. It does not mean that it's not felt, but it has not been reported as much. We are implementing restorative practice within our high school walls. I think it's essential to the success of our community, not just JM itself. And in that, we do incorporate both parents, students, so they can sit, because you can't really feel, Chair Barlow and I were chatting when I walked in about getting the feel of a school. Statistically, you can read what it looks like, but you can't truly feel it unless you're there. The same thing goes for your choice and the impact it's had on others. And parents oftentimes are protective of their child. I am. So when you bring them in and it's in a restorative practice or a restorative circle, and they can see the impact of not just the child that was hurt or whatever, but they see the impact on that child's parent, it does make a much longer lasting benefit, to be perfectly candid, to where then they're following up at home. Social media is a massive challenge, or technology, not just social media. The vast majority of physical altercations that occur in our building typically have spawned from something prior to coming to the building. And so an investigation requires a lot of time. I think transparency, Angie had referenced that, transparency in how the process works is also really important, to share with a parent that this is a process. We're going to be equitable in our investigation, and that means that we're not going to rush to a decision. We'll ensure that there's distance, space, a safety measure in place, but also we want to give a fair amount of time to ensure that what we're coming to a conclusion is appropriate. And what I've found is that parents are still emotionally charged, but they're also more reasonable when they understand that you are validating that whatever the perceived response is or whatever the perceived action is what they felt. Certainly the first thing we don't say to families when they come in is, no, your child was not bullied.
Do you feel, Matt, that there's a change in the terminology people use because of social media? Are kids less likely to say, I was bullied, and more likely to say, someone
Harassing me or activities.
harassed or, snap something out, there's.
I think maybe age appropriateness of it. In elementary, it's about 25 per minute that come to the office that say, Jackie's bullying me. And then, you can, within 5 or 6 questions, get to where you realize it's just a conflict between friends. High school, they don't say that. It's so-and-so's going to jump me, so-and-so's, posting something negative about me online. So they don't. I don't know if it's just a change in terminology or if it's just a growth in regards to their vocabulary. I think that there is a juvenile feel to the term bullying that our high school kids don't carry with them. So harassment is definitely more present. We have had a couple of instances this year. We have where a student made every effort to physically impose their will on another student who is smaller. It fits right within the definition, of bullying. Again, cognitively, as we went through it, that student's intent was not there, but it certainly was the definition of the term. So that's where we had to work with. And the hard part, and to Tom's point,
you know, and I don't know if it's a budget item line or not for district-issued cell phones, but we typically use our cell phones to communicate that too, where we say, look, I understand, you know, 1,520 kids in my building. I can't see everything that transpires, so will you please communicate with me? It's not an effort to get the other child in trouble. Really, in those instances, we're not even looking in regards to consequence, we're looking to restoration. We want to build skills in our students to A, understand what they're doing is hurting, and then the victim in the situation to also empower them to know how to respond independently, because I have students who are going to work after school, and they may have a colleague that's doing something to them at work, and do they have the appropriate skills to ask for support? So then I do say to parents, this is a partnership. We're not in competition, superintendent's reference competition within districts. We have no competitive nature with our parents. We all have the common target of success for all of our students in a safe space and environment. And I think once you get to that point, it continues to be hard because it is a moving target. So anyway, that's
I think we wanted to lay out some basic information, trying to anticipate what you might be wanting to know more about, but maybe we would just open it up to questions from board members to the panel.
Just first last time.
Director
Murray, go ahead.
I won't go first next time. Do you have some sort of school-wide education for students to provide them with some strategies about how they might not only say something to an adult in the building, but also step in a nonviolent way and work to reduce, not to confront the bullies, but that kind of anti-bullying education, so kids know that they can be part of the strategy to make the building a safe place for everyone.
So I can speak to that, yes. And it's a kind of a multifaceted approach because it comes in different ways. In a restorative practice, we sit just like we're sitting here. It gives equal opportunity for all voices to be heard. There is a rigid structure to it that ensures that one voice is not more significant than the other. That doesn't give that push to what you're asking of how do you intervene even if you're not the one being impacted. Right. So in that then we have at JM anyway an advisory. So the vast majority of these issues that we see are freshmen and sophomore. They're not as typical in our juniors and seniors. In our advisory then we have our mental health practitioners, our counselors, our school chemical dependency specialists, our SRO has gone in and worked alongside our special education behavioral coach so that they can see him in a different way too. And he's working in the class and he's not doing it as a response to a illegal action. They're seeing him as an individual who is supportive and a safe person to approach within our building. But then they're talking about, we have reporting systems that are district-wide, of course. We have systems that are found within our school. And then we're having, in some ways, signs or spaces or individuals highlighted that you can go to. We have talked about the strength in numbers. So if you see a student, for example, in the lunchroom, there's 400 and some odd kids at a time, or 500 or whatever. If you see an individual who's isolated or by themselves, to be aware of your situation, situational awareness. Superintendent talked about soft skills and the loss of soft skills in our workplace right now, and reading the room. And I'm working on that with a few adults too, not just kids, but and we have positive recognition for that. If we see those, then those are things we're highlighting on daily announcements. So trying to recognize when those things transpire, and it's very difficult. If you see two individuals who are going to get into a physical altercation in high school, sometimes they're 6'2" and 200 pounds. not every kid feels confident to intervene in that way, but then what is your other options? Where are the adults located? Who are people that can support? How can you increase your size by encouraging a number of students to participate, drawing that student out of it? So we have that set up. It isn't as systemic yet as it can be, so our next step will be to increase that. But for our freshmen in particular, we have a hyper focus on helping them know where and who to go to, especially those who are watching, the innocent bystander who is observing it. So those are focused efforts right now for JM, I can say.
Other levels?
Yeah, at the elementary, we have the second step program. So that's a curriculum that we have all of our teachers teach, and it's teaching really social emotional skills. And part of that is the debugging strategies. So if they are in a conflict with another student, how do you handle that? And how do you handle your own emotions within that? So the first, I don't know all 5 of them off the top of my head, but the first one is to tell the person to stop. And I know the last one is to tell an adult if it doesn't work, through those other steps. So we do have strategies, and we have posters hanging up all over the school, and we teach the kids how to do that when they're in a situation. So at the elementary, I know that at least in our building, that's some of the things that we do.
We also have counselor classes that we added, SEL classes at Bamber, so that our counselor sees on the cycle the whole school. And that helps, and then so with this cycle, we're working on you, me, and empathy. So we're building the skills with the students to know, what does it look like to empathize with one another. The other thing that we did is that we really push with professional development, building the capacity of the staff, because we have to have the adults understanding how to do this so that they can model it for the students. So that we have done through the training for restorative practices and building restoration, like my colleagues were saying, and then having a system in place for the adults to have on their own in their classroom. So then hopefully next year, adults will be on board, students will have counseling, SEL classes, and then there will be morning routine and afternoon routine after lunch, because that's where we see a lot of that happening, that we could check in with the students twice a day, in the classroom to kind of build that community.
We have advisory lessons through Amaze Work and Reach that I think both kind of lend themselves to that. We also have an expectations committee, so kids will make videos about like how do you stand up to a bully, and a lot of that kind of stuff happens tier 1. I also think that I speak to kids in 2 different ways that I think are important. The first one is when we're doing investigations and kids are able to say, yeah, I saw this happen in a classroom or this is going on. Then we talk about like how much courage do you have? Like, do you have enough courage that you could intervene and say something? And when a kid's like, well, I don't know, like that, that feels pretty overwhelming. So then we say, well, what about, do you have enough courage that you would be able to tell an adult? Well, if they're not able to do that, at least you can have the amount of courage that it would take to not participate in it. And so I think that it's important for kids to think about it from those different perspectives, like how courageous can you be, and for them to have to reflect and think about that. And then the other thing is that the longer I work with middle school kids, the more I talk about how peer pressure does not always have to be a negative thing, that like our peer influence can be very positive and what that can look like. So I think trying to, even when kids aren't bullying and they're not the victim, but there's an awareness about it, to make sure that that education is kind of our tier 2 intervention, to make sure that they're thinking about it more deeply.
I think with the urgency that I had at Willow Creek there this year, of really focusing on the behavior and the belonging, I knew I had to take advantage of the advisory time and what that had to be. And so we've done anything from the student handbook to the graduate profile and anything in between related to key empathy habits, self-discipline, anything you can think of that are those soft skills that we want to continue to emphasize with our kids. And I still do those, and I will continue to do them. So 8th grade on Mondays, 7th grade on Tuesdays, 6th grade on Wednesdays, and at the beginning of the year it was just rotated all the way through. They needed to hear from the brand new administrative team. They've heard from Officer Arzolo, they've heard from some of our behavior coaches, they've heard from a variety of voices. Any of you and all of you are welcome at any time to come and speak to them, or come and just, it's a 12 to 15 minute really shot in the arm about behavior, belonging, and the bullying and all those things, of just knowing that they have to know that we're accessible and that we are approachable. So being visible on a regular basis as an administrative team is fundamentally appropriate, mission critical for the kids to be willing to approach us. So that's probably the feedback I've gotten from students and I've gotten from staff has been one of the key things of how well those, because then they get the mass message, because I have a whole grade level of kids, but then I also have the instructional staff there too that has those advisories.
The other part, Chair Marvin, to your question, I think that we fail to recognize is how incredible kids are right now. It is a vast difference, even from 10, 15 years ago. And our students came back from student school board, and those are vocal representatives of our school, but they're not unique. They are the norm. So I have students now that will advocate in regards to an approach a teacher has, and when they come to me to talk through it, they'll say, can we bring so-and-so down and have the conversation together? This is a shift. I mean, if you watch on social media, our younger generation, our current generation, is not idle bystanders in regards to their voice. They're vocal, and we're celebrating the hell out of it. But not only celebrating, giving them the appropriate tools to be heard by all potential listeners. So for me, the charge is not to give them all of those necessary things. It's to not impede them. We talk about a lot. They're the majority. I don't have 1,500 staff. I have 1,500 kids, and I have 100 and some odd adults. So building that capacity, so it's aligning our student council, our student school board, our diversity council, our model UN. It's giving them more opportunity to take the charge and lead. It's paying windfalls in ownership of their space. It's not my decision, it's ours. And it has to be authentic. You can't fake it. You can't say, like, go to student school board, give all that input, come back, and then we'll let a administrator make the decision. We're not responsible for that. They are. And it has to be real. And it's not a program to purchase. It's an authentic listening to their voice and then acting on what it is. We see a giant change when they actually suggest something and it's acted upon.
So I'd like to switch a little bit to the parent end. Occasionally at our level, we will get an email from a very distraught parent who's the parent of the victim, who says, I want to know what you did to the other kid. They were out of school one day and they came back and nothing was done. And I get it, you can't share that information, but how do you communicate that to parents who maybe less, they're not, maybe it's so much like their kids are, who are into this kind of discussion and how can we make things work, but, I want an action and I want it to be really punitive and, bring the hammer down on the kid rather than working to include behavior. So maybe you don't, do you have experiences like that with parents very often? Okay.
That's a yes.
No. What's this you speak of? No, it's easy.
I think a couple things happened there, Julie. I was a CPI trainer for about 15 years. The precipitating factors, the rational and detachment, you look at the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, that person is going to be there to react emotionally to theirs. So you have to listen to them and validate what that concern is. But then you have to assure them with some of the follow-up that we're doing all we can to ensure that their child feels safe. And you're right, we will not be sharing what happened with the other two. And that is not for them to know. But what we can also assure them is that what we can do to have that behavior stop. And then if you need to follow up with that parent too, hey, how are things going? I've seen your child, it seems like they're pretty happy things are going on. Because sometimes the child will be over it and the parent still wants flesh. They want a pound. So you monitor those situations, you hear them. These are their children that they're trusting us with. So be there to help them navigate these harsh and hard feelings that they have, and just to listen.
I mean, fortunately, we don't get a ton of email like this. I mean, sometimes it seems like it goes in waves, but I mean, the school board can't do anything about this. That's not our responsibility. So it can make it difficult to respond to the, well, I guess the chair has that privilege of responding to the parent who's concerned about what are you doing to the other kid.
And what we always hope for is that, have you talked with the building principal, and then get it back to us.
What's that
and
chain of communication?
Hopefully, and then if we'll work with Jackie in her office to continue to remedy it if need be.
I think also a reminder to parents that I can't tell you about the outcome for somebody else's kid, just like I'm not going to tell anybody else about the outcome for your kid. So I think that helps parents keep perspective. And then also making sure that they know on the front end, like, here's how I'm going to investigate it, or I will be really limited in what I can tell you, but I assure you that when we get done, we'll have a safety plan. Then parents feel a little bit better, and usually then there aren't those follow-up questions later because I've already given the disclaimer, like, I legally can't tell you, and that's frustrating. So just honoring and owning the fact that that can be frustrating as a parent.
Dr. Carson. I just had one question. I'm kind of going to bridge the two, I guess, presentations. So in the previous presentation, where they had a slide about what tiers of supports or whether there was no service or a referral was made, I was surprised to see that for bullying, they identified that we do have tier 1 and 2 supports, but the outside referrals aren't made. And I'm wondering if you have a thought as to maybe why that is. Like, are we doing such a great job at addressing bullying, like, head on, that we don't need them to go to therapy as a bully? Or are we just maybe not recognizing that that is an option if the kid just continues to escalate in their behaviors? I was just surprised to see that. Like, in my mind, if I were a teacher and I'm like, this kid's bullying, then he obviously needs something or she needs something. We need a therapist.
I actually sometimes think that we connect the victims more with the need for support than we do the aggressor, which, I mean, just as you're saying that, I'm thinking about that. Like, the kids who are getting bullied have been targeted, and then we wonder, like, why have they sat there and taken it, or why are they being targeted? So I think that probably we see a higher referral rate on that victim side of things. And I don't know how the two are correlated, but I definitely think that there's something there. And I don't know that we refer aggressors. So that is something definitely that I think our team should talk about and reflect on, because you're right about what we know about bullying is that there would be a reason there that would be taking place, but I think that we sometimes lose sight of that.
Yeah, it was like absent that there were external referrals.
Yeah.
I would say at elementary, though, our social workers probably get involved with those kids quite a bit. And like at our school, we meet every week in a tier 2 team, and we talk about those kids. Here's what I saw, here's what's going on, what do you guys think? And we come up with a plan for each kid. And so like today, there's one of our social workers, like, I'll call home and see if they want me to start meeting with that person once a week. And there is always underlying things going on. So I do think that we have a pretty good plan for that with the little ones.
Could be a part of the discrepancy in the data too, is that if I think about the aggressors and the situations that I've worked through in elementary and high school, is that those students are receiving some services or are in the works of receiving some services for something else. So you wouldn't necessarily see it reflected in the data as a referral based on them in the bullying situation, but they may have had another pre-existing variable that happened prior to that, or because as you can imagine, the individual that's inflicting the harm is a multi-layered situation. It's not just in a vacuum for that one situation. So that could contribute to the kind of discrepancy in regards to the data. I can't think of this is my 24th year, I can't think of one kid that has come to school with purpose and intent to harm that hasn't had something driving that prior to it. So I would imagine that referral came from that first. And again, that's assumption, but that's just based on my years of experience.
I'm curious, when I'm looking at the slide here, you're talking about something you maybe touched on a little, but not a lot, is the real or perceived power imbalance. Is that something that you include in your education piece for the students? Is it something that you would include in your thinking? And I'd be interested in your thoughts on how you do that and what you think about. And then also in the post-bullying, talking to the students about that again and how they're, you know, what kind of feedback you're getting from the students at that point in time.
I can speak in the I just had this conversation, but it wasn't necessarily with the, and it probably wouldn't fall within our district definition of bullying, but what we see a lot of isolation with students, and that power is then the strength of a group. So then the student that doesn't have someone to sit with at the lunchroom doesn't feel like they fit within the group, so they don't join extracurriculars, maybe wants to be removed from a class because they don't have peers to, and then that group that has that power. So we do spend a lot of time with all of our resources, and you know, MHPs, counselors, classroom teachers, advisory folks, our student council students had a specific focus on, we tried to do and identify all, we have a thing of seeing everybody every day. Well, that perceived power sits within those groups of individuals who are, you know, strong in number, and then you have those outlier students who aren't recognized. Sometimes it's easy as putting them in a position. I've sent a few here for student school board, and just flipping them in regards to what their position is based on being recognized in a group flips that dynamic a little bit, but we have a lot of conversation around that in a number of different facets at high school.
I'm curious maybe about the lower grade, like how early do you introduce that concept and how do students respond to it?
Yeah, at the elementary, it's pretty rare that we would. I mean, I can't think of really a situation where we've had to introduce that language.
Is it something you think about when you're assessing the situation though, even?
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about how you do that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think we look at, that's part of the investigation. So as we're looking at specifics of the investigation, we're looking at, you know, that imbalance of power, you know, how the student is interacting with other student. And so that's always a factor in what we look for when we're trying to determine the exact situation and whether if it's a true bullying incident or not. So, yeah, I mean, that's always, I think, in our protocols for looking at, you know, those situations. And then I think what we end up, not what I think, I know what we end up doing is we kind of, when we're working with the student, it's more in the kid-friendly, you know, elementary terms than it would be actually using the language just to help them better understand, you know, the circumstances of the situation.
And I think another example would be like a lot of the bad stuff happens out on the recess. So it's just as much as telling the parent or the adult that's out there at that time to kind of hang out here, and here's who's going to be out there to the kid that's being bullied, and it's a fresh fit. And that, you know, if you're talking about an imbalance in power, the adult's there, you know, and that makes them feel safer. So I think the more that you can do those kind of things, it helps.
It often presents at elementary like an older student and a younger student, so even just like physical size or age. So you can talk about that with kids that, you know, you're much bigger than this student, or they don't understand. I remember some situations around kids who maybe have played football for 3 years and had a formal experience, and kids who haven't had that and they're trying to play football together. And my husband always told me, I know you don't think it's a big deal playing football during recess, but it is. So when most of your issues come from a football game, you got to understand that it's a big deal, right? And so even the balance between, I understand the rules because I play on an organized team, or I don't understand the rules at all, and so there's power in what we our experience and what we know and don't know.
Yeah, and I would say at the elementary on the bus is probably where we see that a little bit more, just because that's where bigger kids, yeah, they'll mix up a little bit more. On the playground, not as much. So, and that's a great point. I mean, that's exactly what we talked to a fifth grader about. If they're trying to take a first grader's, you know, school bag or their belongings, you know, while they're on the bus, we'll talk about, you know, their size and how they're older, and then we talk about how they should be able to make better decisions, you know, through that process. But
I think with middle schoolers, I like to use the definition after I get through interviewing and it's clear to me that this kid has been bullying. I like to give them the definition and say, like, here's what I'm hearing happened and here's what bullying is. So let's talk about, like, does it repeat? And yep, it does repeat. Well, let's talk about an imbalance of power. What does that look like? Oh yeah, that. And so I think it's good for kids to come to their own conclusion and say, oh yeah, that probably is bullying that's happening, because I think, again, their reflective process is really helpful in them, like, really deeply understanding kind of the bottom line of what the behavior is.
I think restorative too is important to circle back, because it's hard for you to feel it until that individual shares with you where the discomfort came. And an imbalance of power comes from a myriad of things, whether it's your socioeconomic status, your physical size, the number of friends you have. So sitting in that group and having an opportunity for you and I to share, and for me to say, look, this is how I felt and this is why I felt it. Those are things that we failed to do previously. I as the adult would say to you, here's how you made him feel. Well, that's detached. It's not real. They have to see it. And when a student sits across and cries and says, I'm afraid of you, it instantly hits harder than me saying to them, look, Will's afraid of you. That doesn't connect. So we've failed as adults because I think we try too hard to manage it when we gotta let them be. And sometimes it blows up, but if it blows up, then we're right there to support it. But we've tried to adult it way too much. We gotta get our kids to interact with each other more often.
That's awesome, thank you.
The restorative practices generally as a response to bullying or as an intervention to bullying, I think is really exciting, both because it just seems like a great idea and I'm glad that we're doing it, but also because of how durable the effect is. And Principal McAndrews, you talked a little bit about the CARE Academy. If only we had Comet as the mascot at all of our schools so we could use the same acronym. But I mean, it's the effects that you observed are astonishing. I mean, it's really, really powerful stuff. But I'm just kind of sitting here wondering a little bit, is there been some pushback on this? I got the feeling from Martine's presentation that at least some parents might be hesitant to participate in a restorative circle or restorative process, and don't need like scientific data or anything, but just sort of a felt sense of what how well that approach has been accepted by people in the district.
So I can speak specifically to our CARE program. I think over the course of just a little over a year now, we've had one kid who opted out halfway through the first day. We had one parent who said, just forget it, I'll take a suspension for my kid instead, and the rest of all participated when we have offered it. We don't do a lot of restorations with parents present, but we do invite parents to the CARE exit meetings. We had not done that initially, but now we have started doing that. Because I think it's important for them to see what their kids' learning is. And I think we try to do restorations not involving parents first, because we think it's really important for kids to be able to see that they can resolve conflict and through a conversation with their peers instead of always needing adults to intervene. Sometimes there are things where we've tried to intervene and it does not work, and so we've involved parents and even CERT at some points to just help us with those conversations. But generally, we try to do those with just student to student, but we don't have much pushback. I mean, most parents, when we explain what CARE is, they're like, why doesn't every school do this? So their support of that process has been really good so far.
Great.
So I'm going to go back to the reporting, the original reporting piece, because tying it back to the mental health data that talked about kids not being, in some cases, willing to reach out. And so I'm wondering, I'm asking you to report the unreportable, how much bullying is happening that isn't being reported. And that might be some of what we're hearing from parents or the community, that nothing's being done if it's not being reported. And is our Speak Up for Safety tool, one of the things that specifically identified says you can report bullying, has that been an effective tool, or do you think about anything else that we can do to encourage real substantive conversations when they have to happen.
Jeff has not been, I think I've had 6, and 2 have been adults. So it hasn't been used very often.
Needs to be more advertised.
But yeah, it hasn't been, we've resolved the issues that have happened, but.
Right, but the
word of mouth
hasn't been a
has.
tool to
Yeah,
report it.
Right.
And I think what Matt said earlier about, and I'll combine it with what Dr. Gustafson said years ago, if anyone remembers him. He's one of our research and assessment gurus back in the day. And this was the number guy of all number guys, but school is a social science. You can't measure all these really important things with numbers. So getting into the building and being about that culture, designing your building with that culture. A lot of that culture comes from, look, here's what we choose to tolerate. Then that essentially creates to what we really accept. That becomes your culture. So if I'm going to tolerate kids wandering my hallways and saying bad words to each other and not doing homework, and I don't have any neutral interruptions with that, I just, allowed that to happen in my building. That doesn't mean you're always coming down on them, but you have to have those neutral interruptions constantly, and you have to be visible, you have to be available. The kids can't just see you, in these authoritative figures that we are as principals. Let's just face it, that's what it is. The kids, what has, I think, changed in the evolution of maybe when we would have been in school. I went to Mayo High School, I never saw my principal a day in my life at that school. I don't know if you saw it, Mark. You did!
I'm not going to talk about
it. But that's the point of it is, we need to be abundantly available. They can't just see you as the person that's going to delve out discipline, because they need to be knowing that I can approach Mr. Fogarty, Mr. Ohl, Mrs. Trapp, whoever that team is, my counselors, and you do that in your lunch duties. You do that in your hall duties. The minute that class ends, you should be out in the hallways with the kids, being approachable, strategically placed of where you need to be, to make sure that you are approachable, to be able to see those things. You can observe. I shouldn't be hanging out with Tom when I'm doing hall duty. What do I need to talk to him there? I need to be going to know 15 to 20 new kids that I didn't know the day before. I need to be in those hot spots of where I've identified where the data is telling me, where I need to be getting to know those kids. So then they, maybe they didn't want to tell me that first couple days because I wasn't approachable yet, but I'm the one that reached out and said hi to them first. How's it going? What's going on? Then through that conversation, some things might evolve as to, you are dealing with some things. Let me help you.
I think the nature of bullying is that it's not very observable to adults. It has to be reported, especially with social media, in the ways that kids are bullying, it's not seen.
And I think the sophistication of it, and I don't want to be biased here, but boys seem to be very primitive, I guess, in their approach of here's the pecking order. I mean, you probably knew who the baddest dude was at your school. You know who the guy was you want to mess with. The females are extremely sophisticated in regards to isolation, ignoring, the clickiness, the Mean Girls movie type of thing.
Relational aggression.
How they show aggression.
Yeah.
Males show aggression physically in our society, in a lot of societies. How are females supposed to do it? How do they do it? I would say this year, at what we've seen across the middle schools, we've been very open with parents. Do not send your girls to the Apache Mall by themselves. Really? Yeah. Please, they've been asking to go to the mall. Don't let them go to the mall, because I've seen some of the videos of some of the things that have happened to our females towards each other at the mall. It's not good. So the sophistication, the layers of how that has materialized right now with our females this year has been collectively a lot more of taking our energy rather than a pretty typical hierarchy of where the boys, again, there's going to be, some outliers there, but that's what I've seen being back in the middle school now.
Our students at JM have asked to have a student post where students can go and report concern, and so I think there's obviously great comfort in that, but then there's concern or reservation around it too, because students could come and report that they were sexually abused by an uncle. They could report that they're having a chemical dependency. Those are things that students should not be asked to mediate with their peers. So we have to have some semblance of an idea on how to handle it. Connie referenced in her presentation that a screening, to your question, Chair Cook, was the, what's our next step? We don't want to identify all those things with no structural supports in place to support all that would be foolish. So we're working with our students on how to appropriately set that up and to set some level of parameter. But this would be an instance where a student could go in and talk to their age-alike peers, and there is a comfort there. So we're looking at that too. It is definitely more organic than an electronic system that reports. But students, I think also, we have to be more sophisticated in our listening. Students will write about it in their poems. Students will paint about it in their art class. So we're working with adults in our building on how to identify that as well. If Kent is constantly writing in a certain way, and then it drastically changes, then that may or may not be something. And again, it's not to go to him and say, hey, I think you're sad. It's to say, talk to me about your writing. I'm really curious about this particular text. That's how it shows in those students who are less likely to openly report. Again, we have some work to do with our adults because they're not all equipped to handle what the response might be. So those are the things that we have to address.
Chair Nathan, if I could too. I do think that it's the most bullying, the term bullying is so misused. And I think it's probably the most used word in education. And I think that's why you get those calls. When there's a disagreement between kids, we handle it this way. And people are expecting a pound of flesh because in their mind it's bullying. It's just that catchword that's so popular right now. And so I just think we have to really get out there what it is, and it's repetitive, and it's still serious when two kids don't get along, but kids aren't going to get along all the time. That's just part of growing up. But when it gets to that level, that's when we have to say, okay, that's a different thing than two people. Or like this morning, this kid, he's bullying me. Why? Well, I called him an idiot. Okay, and what did he say back? In his mind, he was bullied right away, and it was real,
Where do we think the elementary students are getting this concept so early?
It's everywhere. It's everywhere, I think.
Even at that young age.
Oh, yeah.
Parents, each other.
Kindergarten, first grade, the parents are saying that to their kids, or they hear it from their neighbors or their grandparents or whomever.
Dr. Brown?
We've kept the principals here for quite a time. I had a question, though. A couple of statements have been made regarding reporting. And our actual policy, 514, speaks of how the reporting should occur, which is through the usage of a form. And though I wonder, we may need to revisit that policy because it seems like the conventional way of reporting is not working. And so more so for the policy committee to maybe take a look-see at that.
Do you mean the student reporting, or do you mean us reporting the bullying that took place?
I believe it's student reporting.
Okay, the student reporting.
It is the form.
Yep, I was just making sure that's what we're.
Why that's useful, depending upon is once you get that initial, we use it as where they can write their statement.
Okay.
So then you can collect it, and then it'll have on the back side of that. And again, if it needs to be revamped, all for it, if it feel like it's more user-friendly. Then there's an opportunity for me to document my investigation on where I believe there was grounds for bullying that would support that if there was not, and then what my follow-up was. So I appreciated it when we created that form because it did create a separate level of reporting and documentation on my end as a building principal compared to all the other disciplinary infractions that may occur. So again, if that needs to be looked at, great, but I do think having that, once you get that, let's fill this one out and see. Then that knows I need to instill this level of investigation. Not to say the other things don't rise to the same occasion of the thoroughness that we do, but it is separate.
Okay, and Chair, if I may, additionally, then also within that policy, it speaks of and identifies a human rights officer or superintendent. I was just curious who that is, or again, if we are going to put that policy in the review process, we may need to change that.
Carl is the human rights officer. Carl Bachman.
You're the human rights officer. Okay?
Dr. Patel is the superintendent.
Or Captain America.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And is that form something that you all are, you use it, it's readily available, it's?
I know we don't have any kind of a standard form, and I don't know if it's necessary in the procedures section for that policy either, so I'll leave that to the superintendent to figure out.
And did you have a comment?
We actually, literally sitting here, I'm realizing we have panorama data on bullying that we actually, in retrospect, could have shared. And it's a complex story, and I won't try and summarize it right now, but they ask it, not panorama, Minnesota Student Survey, they ask it two ways. Have you bullied or have you been bullied? Not surprisingly, very few of our students say, I have bullied. But when we look at the grades, and we will share this with the board and others, have you been bullied once or more in the last 30 days, bullied weekly or more, bullied daily? Very few are saying they've been bullied daily. And relatively about between 14% to 17% say they have been bullied weekly or more in the last 30 days. And between 54 and 39% are saying they've been bullied once in the last 30 days. And so in the 22 data sample, it's not statistically representative, but it's broadly representative. We got a great sample. So that's hard data, I think, to your point, Chair Nathan, that there may be a gap between kids' experience of it and our reporting of it. I mean, I always want to not take that for granted, but these data would suggest that there may be a difference in that. So we'll be taking a look at that going forward.
I'm curious about one thing. Is the definition of bullying provided to the students in this questionnaire?
It's interesting. In these questions, they don't, but then they also break bullying up into some sub-actions that I'm not sure fit the technical definition, kind of as Tom was just saying. Pushed, shoved, slapped, hit, or kicked you when they weren't kidding around. Threatened to beat you up, spread mean rumors or lies about you, made sexual jokes, comments, or gestures toward you, excluded you from friends, other students, or activities. So there's separate data on all of those, and then there is an aggregate, and they just use the term bullied.
I mean, that could be part of the issue. I mean, is what, you've all said it, what is bullying? And this is the definition, and if parents and students don't understand what that definition really is, not that their behavior should be condoned, it has to be dealt with, but it doesn't necessarily fall under that descriptor of bullying.
And none of them included
to a point, Dr. Garcia, I'm sorry.
None included the repetitive either.
Right. The point that Dr. Garcia made last meeting in another context, the Minnesota Student Survey is a highly imperfect instrument with some good scales and some, but we are sitting on some data that actually we will take a look at, and we'll make sure that we share with you. It certainly suggests that we have a subset of our kids who are experiencing this regularly, which is why I'm glad we had this discussion, and I've certainly learned a lot. I want to thank you all for.
Can I add one comment? So let's just say, for example, what those numbers, let's just round them to 10%. 10% of kids think they've been bullied. So back to your original question, which is how many come to us. I guarantee you that 10% of my kids have not reported, and I have not investigated 10% of my students being bullied in my building. So I'm so afraid of how many kids this is happening to that parents don't report. So I several times a year put in my newsletter, like, don't ignore it. If your kid is telling you something that's not sitting right with you, the worst thing that happens is that we investigate and we figure out this is two friends that needed some mediation or some sort of restoration. But if we figure out that it's bullying and we prevent your kid from enduring that for an amount of time, that's important. And so I think going back to my initial point about we always see that advertisement at airports, like if you see something, say something, don't leave your luggage alone, all those things. I think the same thing should be true for how we communicate with parents. If you think that this could be a thing, then let us look into it. Tell us about it before it's 3 or 4 months down the road and you call exasperated, like, this has been happening to my kid, they are not safe at school. And we could do something about it so much sooner, and we could make parents feel better, we could make kids feel safer, we could intervene on problems, but we can't do that if we don't know. So I think I'm scared about what the number actually could be.
I know we've talked in the past that the student handbook isn't necessarily our best vehicle for communicating to parents, but it is our collective source of where we are supposed to be sharing that. So maybe, and I know the bullying policy is referenced and included, who's going to read
In the
77
pages.
Right. But maybe some conversation we can have as we update our new website to providing that resource out there so that it's easily found. If somebody has a question and they're wondering about bullying, there's some place they can go first to maybe think about it before or it might encourage them to make that call. Right?
One, knowing that what Tom said about the cell phone and what Jackie said about us giving out our numbers, it's just a reality. Talking points really helps. But my parents always have my direct number to my phone. Knowing that they have that ease, I'm not going to get the secretary, I mean, I get this person. I can go right to my voicemail and I'm going to check it and know that I'm going to deal with it. I think that helps parents feel at least, okay, I know this isn't going to get pushed under the rug. It's not going to be not dealt with. I'm going right to one of the people at the school that it's right there.
That's part of the culture too.
Right. Thank you. Work in progress. We look forward to, I think we've agreed there's some information we want to provide both in terms of the bullying counts we do have and now some of the Minnesota student surveys. So we'll think about the best way to share that with the board and also with our leaders. So really a valuable conversation, and I thank the board for prompting it because this was not something that administration suggested. It was something that board members put on our radar screens, and as I mentioned, I've learned a lot. Thank you all.
Thank you. This is great. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
So we're going to take a 5-minute recess. We'll be back at 7:15.
We have more?
It's a last night discussion of our senior members of the team realized we need to submit for reapproval, which is required every 3 years. And so I apologize for the fact that this presentation was inserted on your calendar relatively briefly before we are going to ask you, as Chair Nathan just said, to vote on the plan. But the good news is we're in a good place. And the timing of this is directly related to a very good meeting I had with responsible official at the Minnesota Department of Education, verifying that the proposal I'm going to walk you through right now meets the department's expectations. And we all live and learn. And I don't know when the next time I'll be involved in a major reorganization will be, but I will think about how do we identify what might fall through the cracks. But again, we are in a good place, but this is coming to you in a fashion that, as Chair Nathan and I were talking about at the beginning of this meeting, would not be the standard I usually strive to. So, where are we? Minnesota has got a program that today goes by the title Achievement and Integration, and its purpose is to pursue racial and economic integration, increase student achievement, and create equitable educational opportunities, reduce disparities based on students' diverse racial, ethnic, and economic backgrounds in Minnesota. There are many provisions to this, but the key thing to understand is that there is a measure. It actually could lead to some very interesting discussions. But Minnesota defines racially isolated as 20% or more of students in what they call a protected class within a school compared to the district, or within a district compared to surrounding districts. And so the protected class, as you can see there, are students who identify as African American or Black, Asian Pacific Americans, Chicano, Latino, American Indian, Alaska Native, and multiracial. Those categories are taken unchanged from the state legislation. So when a school or a district is identified as racially isolated, there are both consequences and resources that flow not only to that school, but to the district and or surrounding districts. If your district is identified as racially isolated, meaning essentially there's a disparity in the percentage of students of color or students who are indigenous, you need to form a multi-district collaborative council, which needs to involve your American Indian Parent Advisory Committee. And recently, the legislation has been amended to merge the goals of the Achievement and Integration Program with a totally separate, previously totally separate state process called World's Best Workforce. So that's a crash course in what Achievement Integration, or A&I, is. Let me take you back briefly to where we've been. The board previously approved a plan, and the state accepted the plan that is now sunsetting in 2023. That was our previous Achievement and Integration Plan. And I pulled from that plan the bullet points that are listed on that slide, and board members can read them. It flows from Gage Elementary, which was our only school at the time identified as racially isolated, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Identified the districts that we were expected to collaborate with, funding for reading specialists, equity specialists, and then a series of district initiatives that were not funded in Achievement and Integration, but were listed in our plan. And those ranged from some professional development with Dr. Shraki Holly on culturally responsive practices, administration of the IDI cultural inventory, the class tool, some calling out the Employees of Color resource group, something about recruitment of teachers of color, partnership with the University of Alabama at the time, bringing neighboring districts into PTech, having other districts attend the student school board, community schools, and the graduate profile. So that was, those are all the different priorities listed in our plan, which is sunsetting this year and thereby needs to be renewed. The budget for A&I was, in our previous plan and budget, partly linked to those priorities. And so you can see the dollars, and this is determined by a state formula, in our current budget, and we think very similar levels of funding will be continuing in the new plan. We're $3,334,000, and as I'm about to walk you through, the large part of that was used to pay for about 45 full-time equivalent positions. As you'll see, some of those were part-time positions. So you can see, at the time, the Office of Equity and Engagement did not exist, but these positions that we now associate with the work of the office, Will Ruff and Second Leads, were funded at those levels that you see on the screen by that approximately $3.3 million. We also, in the previous plan that is now sunsetting, funded part-time, nearly full-time reading teachers at all of those elementary schools, and a series of other positions and some resources for professional development and support for work at Gage tied to the Spanish immersion program and some additional resources for that. That is the budget and a nutshell summary of the plan that is sunsetting, as every district's plan every 3 years is required to sunset and be reapproved. Here was the dilemma when relatively recently I discovered that we needed to renew the plan and talked with Chair Nathan and Vice Chair Workman about this. All of those positions, for the most part, that are in the current A&I budget are built into the budget proposal for the upcoming school year that we are going to be asking you to approve in June. The reading specialists, the equity specialists, some of the other positions and support for Gage. And so were we to change the A&I budget to reflect different priorities, because obviously we have a strategic plan that is different with different priorities, we would need to find other resources to cover $3.4 million in expenses. And therein lies the conversation that I had with the Minnesota Department of Education to say we have a new strategic plan and a new direction. We want our achievement and integration work to be aligned with that plan, but we have valuable people and work that is being funded in the current budget that is built into the budget we're working on right now for the school board to approve in June. And so the, I think, solution that we have received, when I say verbal, I don't mean questionable, but, very positive verbal approval or encouragement from colleagues at the Department of Education would look like this. That we would be asking you in June, though obviously now, before we submit the plan by March 15th, I apologize, I should have said that. March 15th is the deadline for resubmitting the plan. We would actually largely continue the current A&I budget. Those positions that you saw, there would be a few changes. There's no executive director of curriculum and instruction in the district at present. There are a few of those other things. We would largely carry over that budget going into the 2023-24 school year, but we would propose 3 new priorities that are very carefully aligned with the strategic plan that you have already approved that I will describe briefly in a moment. As board members know, starting this summer, we are going into a comprehensive redesign of how we fund and staff our schools across all of our funding streams, including not just achievement and integration, but general fund, compensatory. And so it is the perfect time to look at this funding stream and be sure that it is tightly aligned with the goals that both the state sets and that you've set in our strategic plan. So we would revise the budget between now and the deadline that we would be given by the state of April 2024 to align with our new priorities. So in short, we would be carrying over the budget from our previous plan, but approving new priorities, and we would revise the budget before April of next year to align with those new priorities. So what are the priorities that I would be recommending to you? There are 3 required goals in the achievement and integration structure. You have to have a goal for each, you have to have a strategy, and you have to have 1 key indicator for each goal. So the first one in the achievement disparity category that I would recommend, the purpose of this category is, as you can see, reduce disparities in achievement among racial and ethnic groups, would be our upcoming work to implement a true multi-tiered system of supports across all of our schools. As board members know, that has implications for literacy, it has implications for the mental health work we just described. And our indicator that I would propose for that would be the percentage of our students who are on track in reading and math on our FastBridge assessments, which are very instructionally useful tools that we're now implementing K through 12. So the first goal would be MTSS in the recommendation that we're talking about tonight and that we're hoping you will be willing to vote on March 7th. Second goal, again, the category is required in the state framework for teacher equity, and we would reduce disparities. That's the purpose in this component of the state structure, reduce disparities in students' access to teachers of color, especially for students of color, but also for white students. And so this would be where we would house our strategy, again, prominent in the strategic plan that you've already approved, to recruit and retain racially and ethnically diverse teachers and administrators. The A&I structure really focuses on teachers, so our key indicator there would be significantly increasing the percentage of licensed teaching staff who identify as a person of color and/or indigenous. So that would be our second goal. And our third, which again is a required state category focused on integration, and in this case, I'm recommending that we would focus our integration work on the post-secondary and career pathways that Will and Heather Hogan described for the board at your last meeting, because, and I have pretty extensive direct experience in this, that is a really great way to have kids interacting across lines of difference, because they're all beginning that work of deciding who they want to be in the future and where they want to go. And so we would house that integration work in implementing post-secondary and career pathways that brings students from diverse backgrounds together in coursework, advisory programs, and post-secondary and career preparation events, both within RPS and in partnership with neighboring school districts. A great example of this right now is what's happening in our P-TECH program, where 70% of the students are from backgrounds that are underrepresented in higher education and high school career. It's a wonderful mix of diversity in P-TECH, and I think the goal would be to build on that as we take that work to scale in all of our schools, but especially our secondary schools. And the key indicator there would be significantly increasing the percentage of those students in those demographic groups who either earn post-secondary credit or an industry-recognized credential, which is something that Heather talked about briefly last week, and we're very excited about for kids who aren't earning some kind of a post-secondary credit, but they are getting one of the industry-recognized credentials that we want to be building out. Then there's an array of those, like Cisco certification and things like that. So that is, again, a whirlwind tour through a proposal that I really see as transitional, in which we would be asking you to carry over the budget from the current A&I, the current year of the current A&I plan, with some adjustments that we would present to you but not major ones, because all of those positions are into our current budget and people doing the work. And then 3 new goals that we would build into the plan and revise the budget to align with those goals. So aligning with MTSS, aligning with diversifying our teaching force, and aligning with promoting interaction and integration across lines of difference in our post-secondary and career pathways in our new A&I plan that we do need to submit by March 15th if we want to meet the state deadline. That, Madam Chair, is a fast overview. Tonight's goal, I think, is to get your questions, concerns, and then ideally to bring this before you in a review of the plan the 7th so we could meet the March 15th deadline. It is always possible to ask for an extension from that, but I didn't want to start there in the hope that we could still meet this deadline, because I feel that MDE really was great in understanding that we have a new strategy and this work is central to it. And so we want to align this with our strategic plan so that this is not something kind of hanging out there outside the core of our strategy, and rather is really integrated deeply into where we're headed as a system.
Any questions, board members? So one that I have is, to make it clear, people are looking at the current budget and perhaps looking at their own positions. And I'm assuming that also part of this process is to determine if we don't fund any of these positions through the A&I plan, how else we might fund them in the, not this next year's budget, but in the budget for 2024 onwards.
Yeah, great point, Chair Nathan. We would, obviously pending that full-scale redesign that we are going to undertake as articulated in the strategic plan to rethink how we fund and staff our schools, we would look at those positions and decide if those are positions that fit the strategy going forward, we would resource them from other resources. Obviously, it's premature to talk about the specifics of that, and so I don't say this with any alternative strategy in mind, But to give an example, I would want us to look at those reading specialist positions through the lens of the science of reading work that Dr. Ogbarmu is leading, to be sure that that is aligned with where we're going in terms of the new strategy around literacy. And so we would take a look at those positions. We would make sure that the functions that we're currently supporting with these dollars are either picked up by other resources or realigned to fit with our strategy going forward.
Dr. Barlow.
So irrespective of the carryover year 22, 23 to 24, 25, the funds will still be there.
We need to have the plan approved to get the funds. So assuming we get the plan approved, yes, the funds would be there, but we do need an approved plan both by you as a board and then by the state to access the 3.4 million. But it's not competitive. If you approve it and they approve it, we do get the same approximate level of funding.
So really, the thought behind that is we have opportunity, well, you as superintendent will have opportunity, as you've already have informed us, to develop the plan moving forward. And it is quite possible that some of the funding, A&I funding, could potentially be used to fund other things other than the things which are currently identified as a part of the plan, and that no position necessarily would drop out. It could be funded through a different source.
Perfectly said. That I would envision most of our A&I funding would actually go to these three new priorities: MTSS, teacher diversity, post-secondary and career pathways, which are top priorities in the strategic plan and need resources, and that the things that are currently in our A&I budget would be either supported through other funding sources or reintegrated into our different strategies going forward.
Thank you.
Dr. Cook.
I think that this plan makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad that it came together, even though it was, as you said, not in the way you'd normally like to present it. But what was it about looking at the first goal, the reducing disparities in achievement among racial and ethnic groups? What is it about the MTSS implementation that jumps out as an appropriate strategy for addressing that goal, as opposed to something else in the strategic plan?
When well implemented, MTSS is all about accelerating learning for students or social emotional development for students who are struggling. We know from our data, which are those disparities, that the students who are on the wrong side of those disparities are our students of color and our Indigenous students. And so MTSS is all about supporting those students who need that additional support, either at Tier 1 in their regular classrooms, in Tier 2 largely in the classroom but with additional support like tutoring, intensive, or at that Tier 3 where we need to have really intensive supports for them. And so MTSS broadly is all about closing disparities by providing the needed supports, first of all, in that Tier 1, so all students are experiencing that guaranteed and viable curriculum. And so that's the logic. It could have aligned with something, as you saw in our previous plan. There's some work around things like culture responsive teaching and things like that. I think there's better evidence around MTSS and closing disparities than some of those other strategies. That's not to say those aren't valuable, but I think this is more tightly aligned because it is all about differentiating around kids' needs. As this board has talked about many times, too often in this district, an extraordinary array, and other districts, an extraordinary array of needs is needing to be met by the same classroom teacher in the same classroom without differentiated supports either in that classroom or elsewhere. And that's what MTSS is all about building out. And we're on the cusp of getting a review of MTSS in the district from the university that we'll be sharing with you and all of our stakeholders in the next couple of months. So that was the logic behind it.
But to be clear, as it's anticipated now, the implementation of MTSS will not be sensitive at all to racial or ethnic disparities. It's about addressing the needs of students, right?
Yes, but it's actually, it's a really interesting discussion. There's an increasing school of thought that sort of says if you do want a design that attaches all kids, but that devotes additional resources to the kids who need it the most. So the design is universal, but the resources flow where the needs are. So yes, MTSS is neutral to demographic factors, but it is identifying resources based on academic, mental health, or social emotional needs. And in our district, the students who need the most support are students of color and Indigenous students.
So
stop.
Our expectation is that a natural consequence of implementing MTSS well will result in an alleviation of these racial disparities.
Absolutely. When I'm out, I'm meeting with every one of our school and program staff right now about the strategic plan, and I take the graphic out. And one of the questions that once in a while comes up is, well, I see equity in one of the building blocks, but where is equity? And so the discussion we have is MTSS and other priorities are all about equity. Even though that is not the word that is there. And it's a very important point. It's not just along racial and cultural lines. It's all of the lines of difference and meeting kids where they are with the additional supports.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Dr. McLaughlin. It seems to me that the presentations we've had most recently from administrators or staff about Frastbridge that's geared more towards the elementary level. Do I understand that?
We're actually rolling it out K-12, actually, and so we are moving it into middle school and high school. You're right, we have an earlier start with elementary, but we are taking it into middle school and high school as well.
So the idea, though, going forward for Goal 1 would be Frastbridge reading and math assessments. Would that be K-12 then?
Yep.
Okay. But it looks like Goal 3 is specifically for our secondary students. Is that?
That's a really important question. I personally believe that preparing for life after high school does start at the elementary level, but it starts with more of a focus on self-discovery. Who am I? What are my sparks? What are my likes? I think that lays the foundation for kids in middle school beginning to understand the world and careers and things. We have another DISC team that is doing that design work right now that Will and Heather talked about last week. And so, yes, I think the most intentional work would be secondary in that space, but it absolutely could involve elementary students as well.
And I think the reason I asked the question is that the indicator seems to indicate secondary.
Yep, I think that's a really good point.
Is there something that you could wrap in there to include the younger grades as well, if that's the intent of, particularly of the funding?
Yeah, it's a really perceptive question, and we'll give that some thought. I think in part, it's thinking about having students within schools from different backgrounds interact, kind of depends on the demographic of that school. And part of what we're hoping for in the post-secondary and career work is that kids, like it happens at PTAC and CTAC, are interacting with kids across schools. And that I think we can do with college fairs and STEM fairs and career exploration activities. So it probably does, just because kids are older and we can move. The other thing is we do need to, and we have reached out, and this will be reflected in the plan that we would present you with, we do need to have that inter-district collaboration. So we've reached out to the surrounding districts around us, all of whom also get funding to support, frankly, work with us that candidly wasn't really happening. And the early discussions with them have suggested that this post-secondary and career emphasis is very much a shared priority for them, and that they're eager to be working with us in that space, probably especially at the high school level. But we can give that some thought, think about if there's ways to make sure that the elementary kids are included in that part of the strategy.
And I would say that kind of the same thing for the first goal, if there's a way to make sure that it's communicated, that everyone's going to understand that this is K-12 and not just in the early grades.
Thank you.
Director Mark? I thought I wouldn't ask another question. Just a quick process question. I want to make sure I understand this right. March 7th, the board will be asked to approve a budget and the priorities, and I think the priorities are exactly right. And then the only change is that in 2024, the board will approve a different budget for A&I, and that'll be submitted to MDE. The priorities will stay the same?
Yep.
Okay, good, thanks.
But the new budget will be aligned with the new 3 priorities.
Okay, thanks.
which, just so you know, what was I so worried about? There was the concern that they would say, nope, your budget must be completely revised right now, when staffing meetings are largely done. And so I'm really, really grateful that the department understood we're going to need to have a flex year here. And April 1 will be the deadline for that revised, April 1, 2024 will be the deadline for that revised budget.
Any other comments, questions, inputs? Great, then we'll put this on the agenda for March 7th.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is the updated ABCD. Are there any items that a board member would like to put on a future agenda? Hearing none. There were no other questions asked about any agenda item prior to the meeting, so there won't be any Q&A in board docs. Our upcoming meeting dates, March 7th at 5:30, a regular meeting. Regular meeting March 21st at 5:30, a regular meeting April 11th at 5:30, and a study session on April 18th at 5 o'clock. And hearing no other business, this meeting is adjourned at 7:43